Hello and welcome to the Voice of Reason podcast. I'm your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's guest is Ayla, who is an online virtual sex worker. She does a lot of sexy photography and stuff of that nature, but she's also quite a sharp cookie, and she wrote an article that really impressed me on her blog, which I linked below, and I reached out to her because I wanted to talk about her take on gender and sexuality as somebody who interacts with that quite often. So this conversation explores that, and to be perfectly frank, it's really difficult to interview somebody who's naked because, the interview process is to allow the interviewee to successively disrobe themselves till you get to an intimate core. So it's really hard to start from the base level of nudity. Where do you go from there? So I don't know how well I did, and she's also very keen at reaching through the screen and making contact with the person who is interacting with her. So rather an experiment, but quite a clever and wise woman, and proud to have her on the show. Let's get to it. Here is Ayla. This blog post you wrote in May called Readjusting to Porn has some very powerful insights, especially around gender. That I just wanted to hear you talk about, because I've been doing a series on gender and talking to a lot of women about what it means to them. And you get right to the way in which male attention, or I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you say that you feel gendered when you position yourself as something that is seen by men. I was wondering if you want to expand on that, or we can do more of your biography. I don't know how many of these you do. How bored you are of your own story?
I'm not bored, because I think I focus on different things every time I talk about it, so I don't get bored. But I noticed this most specifically. I cammed for about 5 years, and then I quit camming. And 5 years has been when I was 20 to 25, so this was the majority of my adult woman sexual life as out in the world. And then so I didn't really have a lot of other experiences. And when I quit, I noticed that I really wanted to wear really baggy clothes and not do feminine things. When people talk about, being agender or something, that really resonated with me in the sense the aesthetic of it, not necessarily a deeper philosophical thing. And then it made me realize just how much my role in society affected the way that I experienced gender. It was really salient to me. And I noticed it again when I started doing online sex work, how I felt, again, extremely female. The sense of I am a woman, came up because it's a response. It's a role that I'm playing.
Mm-hmm. Were those baggy clothes or being more agender, was that kind of incognito in a way? Kind of passing through society without the traction of being paid attention to as a woman or within your femininity?
I think it was an attempt to readjust what I was signaling as valuable about myself. When I was a cam girl, it was my physical appearance was what got me money, and it's got me through the world, and the thing which I sort of used as a tool. And so it was sort of a reaction to that. Okay, I want to try using other things as tools, and I want to be very obvious about this in the way that I interact. Mm-hmm. This is obviously reversed, as you can tell.
I can only tell so far. I mean, your clavicles are very lovely, I will say. Wait, are clavicles the thing on the end of the fingernail or the... Okay, I was right. Cuticles. I was getting mixed up. When you were... One of the things that I have... explored is young women, specifically detrans women, and their relationship with their femininity, kind of going through a phase of kind of backing away from it and then kind of going back into being a woman, which is really interesting because it shows kind of the process of being aware of that. Were you, was it startling to suddenly, as a human being, be paid attention to by men in a certain way when you're growing up? And what was the way in which, as a cam girl, you kind of mastered that attention? What were some of the things that you had?
I'm not sure, because I guess I'm such an outlier. Because I was raised like a fundamentalist evangelical Christian, and I was homeschooled. And so my like exposure to like the way men and women and sexuality are is like completely different from what most people are exposed to. Like I never, like it was, you're not supposed to kiss before marriage was like the idea. Yeah. And I was homeschooled, so the only people I knew were other people who thought that too, and weren't allowed to watch media where people did things like, you know, get frisky before marriage. So like my concept of like men paying attention to me as a sexual creature is like basically non-existent. I went through my entire teenage years with this almost not happening. It's sort of like occurring like in isolation in my own mind. Like I knew that I was supposed to be desirable, but this wasn't really reflected in the world around me. And so I think when I got to adulthood, I approached it sort of like in a naive, very straightforward way. Like I hadn't been impacted already. And so it was very straightforward. I'm like, okay, I have a body. Men will pay me to look at the body. This seems like a normal thing to do. And it was very cut and dry. It was like my body was a tool.
And that was primarily through virtual format, through a video, something removed from actual men. That's kind of how you...
I was pretty slutty too. I wasn't doing sex, like in-person sex work at the time, although I did eventually start doing that. But I also had that applied to like sex because I didn't understand how people did sex. And as far as I got, people got horny and then they had sex. And so when I got horny, I would just go to a nearby male and be like, do you want to have sex? And then we would. So I just had sex with a lot of people.
Oh, okay. And yeah. Was it like a persona in a way, like this sexual persona, or in like constructing an identity and an online identity? How did you construct that? What were like the steps of doing that? How did you explore the feedback, and how did you know you were doing the right thing, or that you're going in the right direction?
In terms of gender or in marketing?
Okay, that's a good question. So there is the marketing, which would be how to expand how many people are watching you, right? So how to grab attention, right? So there's that facet. And then within the act of being a cam girl, there's the maintaining the attention or the manipulating of the attention, and not in a negative sense of the word. How did you go about, I guess, learning those two paths?
Lots of trial and error. When I first started camming, I was basically just really unfiltered myself, sort of like the little bit nervous self. I was extremely awkward. This is how I started miming. I started doing like mime shows on cam, and I became I was extremely goofy and a little bit high energy because I didn't really know what like femininity was. I was just like myself except naked, and that did okay. And then over the years, it was like I did many hundreds of hours of camming, and it became like a fine-tuned adjustment to figure out like what version of myself actually generates the most income. And I had a piece of paper that I had printed out in a very nice design with like rules for myself to follow. And I put it right behind the camera. So I would watch it every time I cammed. And I forget exactly what they were, but it's something like smile more, talk slower, use smaller language, look directly into the camera, and laugh. It was stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So over time, I started shifting from this kind of like pretty nerdy, little analytical, like I would talk about concepts a whole lot, to like a much slower, like you can see in my body language even now, like I have a camera on me so I can feel myself like a little bit doing it. But I learned that just, you can't talk too quickly. You have to use small words and be really amused by the jokes other people make. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And then when did that, and this is more of a question, less about sex work, just being a performer, was there like a kind of a distance that you put between the person that you are for those hundreds of hours and who you are like that? There was like a wall there, and did that become permeable, or was it pretty easy to like don that?
I think for me, it's, again, a little bit of an outlier. I'm a highly compartmentalized person in general, as in like the parts of me that engaged with different sort of environments tend to look very different. Yeah. I don't consider this to be a negative thing or like not a true self. I consider every compartmentalized part of me to be an aspect of like my true, genuine self. So yes, I have very like distinct modes of behavior, and I consider those to be like good in that mode. And there is permeability as much as I feel I have the capacity to. Like, for example, when I was an escort, I was very, very compartmentalized with that person. Like I kind of transformed into a different person, but I had the ability in some clients to like allow some sort of like real genuine like love in a sense, compassion and like come through. And I would experience that as an escort. Like I would really feel like affection for these people, but it was still like only to the degree which it felt like safe to do so, in the sense like it didn't go too far to actually blur the capacity I had to do the work.
Okay. And when you're speaking about work that's so intimate, like an escort, which is, it can slip into types of maybe even psychology, or it's very intimate. You're contacting with people in an intimate way. Are there tricks that you like, awareness of how you're evoking too much intimacy from the man, like becoming too clingy, or him becoming too clingy because of certain signals that you're giving off? Was that kind of like an exploratory process too?
I think I did well in it, mostly. There occasionally people get clingy, but mostly people know what it is. And mostly people go to escorts for that sort of disassociation. Like they don't want to have the strange clinginess that they might get. So most people, it wasn't an issue. There was a small number of people who started to feel like affection for me, that sort of like they started making attempts to connect outside of the frame that we had established. And usually when that happens, I just like totally ignore. Send me an email, I don't ignore. Or if they say a thing, I just like act like I didn't hear it. And then eventually I would be like slower to answer their emails to sort of like give a proportional signal to their clinginess that I'm pulling away. And I don't know if that was ideal in all circumstances, but it seemed to work overall. That's
pretty masterful, crafty. Non-confrontational in a way, as long as they pick up eventually on the subtlety.
Right, and the more that they don't, the stronger my signal becomes.
What do you think, this is a really broad question, so feel free to batter me around till I get it down to size, but what do you understand about men by interacting with them in the way that you do? Like, what is something that you can extrapolate, like some sort of wisdom or advice with dealing with men, or like what is it like how to unlock the man, maybe on just the desire level, but you do more than just interacting with desire with regards to how you communicate and stuff like that. What are some of the insights that you've gained that you find other people don't know, or that are kind of...
Well, when men want to be what women want, that's like the really important baseline. And so men respond really strongly to signals in culture about what women want and what they should be. And so like a lot of guys who are pursuing sex workers still have this in their mind. Like they want me to genuinely like them. Men want to be accepted. And so this comes into sex so much of the sexual interaction. It's not just about sex. It's about like being accepted by the woman. And I think that's like what that symbol is. Like the thing that you are, the desires you have, the body you're in, like the needs, like that is okay with me. Because so much of the interaction between men and women is like sort of a threat and power thing. Like a lot of women are like, no, you can't. And men like have these needs that they're constantly looking for. And so that creates this tension that sort of, I think, bleeds into everything, into like emotion and intimacy and everything. Because like, I mean, it makes sense. Like when I have a male friend who needs a shoulder to cry on, like it's going through my head, like, is he trying to fuck me? And that's often quite true. So with sex work, like you don't have to have that question anymore, and that like tension between the two dissolves. And so you get like a really cool access to some sort of intimacy that often a lot of men just have never experienced before. If that answered your question. But
yeah. What are some of the broad, there's not just one feminism. I've spoken with a lot of women specifically about feminism, and it seems like there's a lot of different brands of feminism. So everybody kind of has their own kind of brand of feminism, but there's these distinct schools: gender critical, sex positive, sex negative, liberal feminism. What are some of the things that you think that feminism, broadly speaking, gets wrong about the relationship, the power dynamic between men and women? Or some of the things... What's that?
I think it's dehumanization. I think a lot of feminism dehumanizes like the personhood of men. Like there's a way, I feel like ideally if people treated each other well, it would be as if they were in love with each other. Like, how would you treat somebody if you were madly head over heels in love with them? And like, it might seem a little insane, but it's like really good. Like anything that they do, you really understand why they did it. And like, maybe you have to work out, you know, issues that you have, but there's this, that you're coming from this place of like, you're perfect in a way. And this is totally non-existent with feminism in regards to men. Like there is no, like, I'm deeply in love with you sort of vibes coming out. It's like how would women treat men if they were deeply in love with them, but still wanted to institute boundaries? And it would be something like really deeply listening to their pain.
Okay. And you took that to a completely deeper level. Like it seems like you could have gone so far as to say there's not enough good faith for men, but you say that there has to be more than just good faith. There has to be like a deep love. Could you explain what you mean by that love then? Like that like you're using very powerful language.
Oh yeah, it's just like a heuristic I have. Like if I'm thinking about someone and like I'm having a reaction to someone, then I do the question, I check, like, how would I feel if I were in love with them? And then that sort of like shows me this alternate way that I could handle them. Mm-hmm. And I realized that that's better. Like that's just, it feels better to feel in love with people.
Okay.
Not always. Sometimes I just hate and I'm like fine with it. I'm not saying you have to, but it's like, it's nice to think about.
What do you, do you feel that that's intentional, or are you pretending to be in love with them, or are you, is there any spontaneity in that? Is this like some superpower you have to just inhabit that place of genuine love and care for people? That seems kind of taxing in a way, to be able to be so emotionally open and invested in somebody.
I mean, sometimes it's easier than others. I've gone through like phases where it was like my default state of being for like a year and it was great. Now I'm like, you know, I don't feel that like automatically all the time. But I think it just comes with a vivid imagination. Like if you just sit and concentrate on it a little bit. Yeah. But also I don't mean to judge people who don't do that. Like it's fine if you don't want to feel like you love everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. In your essay, again, and I'll link it because it's very powerful, you say that when you got back, and this is really personal, so you seem like a very open person, but you talk about getting back into camming and wrestling with this hatred, I think you used the word hate, of men, or like anger, maybe, that is? Yeah. What was that? And how have you, this is from May, so it's been a few months. Why do you think that was? Because that seems like the opposite of that love that you're saying. Yeah,
definitely. I think that they can exist in conjunction. Like similarly, how I think feminism's problem is dehumanization of men. I think a lot of men also dehumanize women. It's like, it's not, I don't think there's really an asymmetry going on. I think it's quite equal. And so in this, it's just like, I have encountered so many times where it's obvious that the thing that they care about is not me, it's my body. And I'm aware that this is what I'm signing up for. Like, I know that this is what the deal is. I'm not being faked out. So most of the time it doesn't annoy me, but like there's some, I think especially transitioning from where I was non-sexual to sexual online, and then like seeing that shift happen, was like, it hit me a little bit harder that time, because it's kind of painful. Like it's not that much fun, especially like if you're not aroused in return. Like asymmetric sexual desire is like really not fun for either party, really. So yeah, I have like a lot of like resentment towards men, and it feels sort of like necessary resentment, like in order to have some sort of self like distance from what's going on. It's like a survival mechanism in some sense. I don't necessarily endorse it on like a very deep level, but I definitely experience it.
Some sort of protecting mechanism, or to make that line between you and what they see more distinct in a way. Yeah. Do you see in your line of work and in the culture at large, do you see, especially for men, if there's, I don't want to go down any sort of judgmental route, but is there things that they should be aware of with, young men, their first contact with sexuality, more often than not in our culture, in our day and age, is through some sort of virtual edifice, interface. Do you think that that's necessarily good for them? And do you have any thoughts on how that might shape or mold men, just from your perspective? Or to bring it in a less judgmental way, are there things that you see that men could improve on with their sexuality that they're not getting and developing through the virtual medium, especially young men?
Yeah, well, don't trust sex workers, obviously. Not that they're all the time inaccurate, but that you're not going to get a negative signal. Is if you're hypothetically this young man. Because like with sex work, they'll give you a positive signal if you're doing something they like, but they'll also give you a positive signal if you're not doing something they like. So just be aware that you need to seek out negative signals, and that will be some sort of indication that what you're getting is genuine. Especially in your real person, like online, this might not be the case, but just that's I think really important. A lot of people don't understand that. And a lot of men who I think are trained on the online sex work stuff will encounter a woman IRL who gives them a negative signal, and they might take that really personally. Like this is evidence of their own failure in some way.
Okay.
When this is absolutely not. This is normal. This is what if genuine interaction is like. So.
Are there projects that you're working on? You said today that you wanted to write. I'm just wondering, what is that? Where are you at with developing your writing, and what direction are you going with that? What are some of the big ideas that you're tooling around with?
You mean for the book I'm working on?
Yeah, I guess, unless you want to keep that under wraps, but just generally, what's your philosophical life, or your that part? What's going on there? What do you? You have
such your series of questions is really interesting. Like most people's questions feel like they're tied on the string. Like I'm following a string of my hands and I get a knot, and that's the question, and then I keep going. And yours feels kind of like I'm getting balls thrown at me from opposite sides of my head.
Okay,
it's really interesting. Anyway,
it'll congeal. I promise.
Yeah, it's just interesting. Okay, right. The book,
and feel free to dodge any of the balls too.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'm totally good with that. I want to teach people how to stop suffering, because I learned how to stop suffering, and that's the core of it. I think sort of that a place of full acceptance is really safe, and you don't have to feel maybe the way you do anymore. That's the deepest level thing. But there's a lot of other things I want to write about sort of my life. I want to write about the way that people change their minds, because I used to be very fundamentalist and extremely intolerant, and I changed, and now I see a lot of people who really hate the kind of person I used to be, and I'm that's not how you treat that. So there's this whole area where how to actually recognize when what you believe might be wrong, even when it feels like the truest thing you've ever known. Mm-hmm. So a lot about that too. I don't know, just fun stuff.
That fundamentalism, that clinging tightly to an idea, was that a very sharp break for you, or was it a gradual kind of shift?
You mean when I lost my faith?
Yeah. I guess the word lost your faith is pretty cliff-like.
Yeah, it was very cliff-like for me. A lot of people have it very gradual, but for me it was pretty immediate. I had been raised in a very logical faith. My dad's a professional Christian evangelist, and he has a radio show and writes books and has a very large evangelical website and debates prominent atheists and stuff.
Okay.
And so growing up, I was very exposed to all of it. It wasn't don't ask questions we're not here. It was very upfront and yes, we're going to talk about the doubts you have, and face that, because we have the truth. And so I really had this sense we have the truth. We're not shying away from it. We're asking really hard questions. And so the last straw was, I think I was 19 or something, almost 19, and I had just moved away to college. So this was the first time I'd been around people who were not religious. And I think like that was really important. I didn't realize it at the time, but like somewhere mentally before I had been around non-religious people, I didn't have a concept of non-religious people that wasn't negative. Like they were secular, they were secretly liars and cheaters and immoral, and they would hurt you, and like they might act nice and they might be like seem to be really good people, but like deep down you couldn't trust them. But actually leaving home and being around them and seeing that the world functioned and that people were kind to me and like I could potentially have a life here, that sort of like gave me the space to actually consider that maybe what I believed was wrong, when I don't think I could have allowed myself to actually think about that beforehand, because that would have meant sacrificing too much. My Christianity was very much a load-bearing belief. It was like holding up my function in so many ways that like my brain would refuse to let me consider that maybe it wasn't true because it knew it would break me. So once I got to a position where it wasn't going to break me, there was like an argument that I thought of that like I hadn't heard before. And it, for the first time, it allowed me to really consider my faith from the outside. I was like, wait, I seem to be putting in a lot of effort to make sure I believe this. Like there's a lot of mental processing going on into explaining all of the holes that people are poking in. And like, maybe the truth shouldn't be that exhausting. And so once I like thought, like, what is it like if I didn't try to like hold this up? Then I realized it was like, it didn't make sense really. And then everything just crumbled. And then I lost it basically within the span of like 2 minutes.
Oh, wow. Okay. I've noticed I come from a somewhat fundamentalist background, but I'm very interested in cults and cult mentality. And we see this a lot in our political landscape right now, a lot of very fervent believers. And a pattern that I've seen is that people who are really strong believers kind of bounce around from one extreme to another. You have extremists, like your basic garden variety, white supremacist extremist. He gets out of that. He goes really directly into another thing that he firmly believes in. A lot of addicts, too, they go from very intimate relationship with this substance, and then they go really fervent into Christianity or something that brings them out of that. I wonder if that's a personality thing or what, but what was it like to navigate like a post-structured existence? Did you have to go and find another structure, or were you able to not have such a firm structure that you found in that fundamentalism?
I wonder if you're like touching on something that seems like a really good point, and I wonder if we can tease that out a little bit. I think that when people transfer in that way, there's probably a couple different subcategories of this. Like for example, you're mentioning structure here. Like people want a system of rules to tell them what to do, and if they lose one system, they'll find another. I think there's like multiple reasons for why people are really dedicated. At the time, I was pretty extreme. I was pretty extreme even for my community because I took things literally. I was like, if this is what it says, then this is what it says. Like, I was like, very like, we have to see this through. Like, I was extremely curious, and I just like followed things to their conclusion, even if it seemed incongruent with people around me as a Christian. And so that was like what helped me get out of Christianity, because I was like this really strong, like, we can't think of the externalities. We have to go like just through it. Like, don't let yourself like be cowed by this line of thought. You have to really face it. And so that's like a big part of what allowed me to leave Christianity, because I was ready to like punch through any wall. And I think that translates to me now. Most people view me as like a relatively controversial figure, which I don't feel very controversial, but people react to me in that way sometimes. And I think it comes from a very similar thing. I hold a lot of like quite unpopular opinions because I think like I carried over that same sort of extremist view. I'm like, we're just going to punch through every wall that we can find. So I think that was what I translated over. It wasn't necessarily an appeal to structure. I haven't really found any sort of similar structure to Christianity since leaving.
Okay. But you like pounding through structures. You find an idea and you go all the way with it, or in a way, like Juggernaut. Do you feel like if you keep on going, just like the whole world's gonna just be like one big pile of rubble because you're gonna keep on smashing through things like Hulk?
Well, that's the idea. I mean, I did that to myself for a while, and then I became a giant pile of rubble. I was pretty non-functional for a while. Yeah. What was
the term from going, and I'm asking this not just for you, but for other people who've gone through that or people who are going through that right now, what were some of the changes in reestablishing yourself as something that's not a pile of rubble. How did you get out of that?
Are you talking about the after acid part or the after Christian part?
Oh, so I didn't know about the acid part.
Yeah, there's a year where I did pretty high doses of acid about once a week for a year, or almost a year. Yeah. And that was a pretty strong dissolution. Yeah,
were you doing that studiedly, like with some sort of regimen involved? Was there an intentionality in that process, or it was just kind of like having a cigarette? It's like something you did.
Comparing acid to having a cigarette.
Well, I'm just saying, like, how seriously did you take this very hard drug? You know?
Yeah, it's close to having a cigarette.
Okay, yeah.
But for me, it was like, pounding through a wall. Like the first time I took acid, like it shattered me. Okay. I was completely changed. I was like, oh, fuck, this is a new way of looking at myself that's like sort of leaves behind a lot of the things I was attached to. And I was like, that's the thing that I want. And then I just kept eating it and eating it and eating it until like I destroyed all the things I was attached to. And then I like, barely eat and function at that point. And then I stopped.
Okay. And stopping that external or stopping that substance allowed you to go back to more function.
It took me about 10 months to go in, and then it took me about another 10 months to come out. I'm permanently changed from it. This is how I stopped suffering. But yeah, I'm mostly functional now.
I know this is another curveball, but what do you mean by suffering? And how do you extrapolate that into a general principle for people to land on to understand what you're talking about?
I know, it's ridiculous. It's like a ridiculous thing to attempt to do. But there's like, okay, I have one example. So throughout my life, I had like this thing in the back of my head where I was like kind of afraid of being homeless. Like being homeless felt a little bit like losing the game. Like, oh, I lost my job and I'm having trouble eating and I'm sleeping on the street. Like that's like the floor. And so I would always sort of like really not want to be on the floor. And it was sort of this like reactionary thing, like, well, at least I'm not there. And then during the period of like, punching my own walls open, there was a point where I really came to terms with the fact. I like looked at my fear of being homeless, like stared it straight in the face. And I realized like, okay, if I'm homeless, then what? And then I like went through this very strong imaginative process and decided that actually this is fine. This is not the end. This is not losing. My life continues and it's just as valid and valuable. And after that, I stopped being afraid of being homeless. And I still tried not to be homeless. Like this didn't really affect, my motivations or my desire to not be cold or eat. But there's a way in which like the way that I was acting didn't come out of this resistance. Like it was like this wall of homelessness was there. And then after I came to terms with it, it's like I could reach through it openly and like act not out of fear. And so this is a very small example where like, I want to generalize this to everything. Like you can become not afraid of everything, even though you may act as though you are. And I think that this is like what really comes down to suffering, like including pain. Like if you're experiencing pain, like it's okay. Like you can look at it, become one with it, and then realize that this is not something you're afraid of.
Okay. As opposed to using some form of pleasure seeking to avoid that pain. It's more confrontational in a way.
I don't mind avoiding pain. I'm fine with pleasure seeking to avoid pain. But I mean like pleasure seeking like as a way to like because you can't be okay with that pain. Okay. Like because like in somewhere you have a belief in the back of your head that believes that experiencing that pain will be the end of the world. Even if consciously you might not like agree to it. But like it's like the bad, the evil is if you experience this one thing. And that's not true.
You seem like you have a lot of compassion.
Thank you.
Do you think that's natural? Did that come from something, or was that something that you left behind? Do you have a relationship with that part of you?
I think, where does compassion come from? I think it comes from like, well, I guess like some form of self-destruction. Like I feel very self-accepting. I'm okay with basically every single thing that I experience. And that with that comes acceptance of what other people experience.
Okay. Yeah. And how does that, How are you going to write about this?
I don't know, man.
Or is it going to be like
a problem?
Like a book about a woodshed or something like that? Or is it going to be a 7 steps to a sexy, healthy life kind of thing?
I figure I'll probably just like write what feels good to write, and then it'll just come out if it wants to, and if not, then that's fine. Yeah. Like, it's possible that the message won't come through in the book at all.
Okay.
But I kind of trust the process, you know?
You're very thoughtful on Twitter. What's your relationship with that medium? You're very powerful in your thoughts, too. I appreciate your sentences. That's a high compliment from me.
Thank you. How many times do you give that compliment?
Not that often, actually. There's I appreciate your sentences, and then I'm envious of your sentences, which is a very rare thing for me to be actually.
All right, so we haven't hit
sentences.
envious yet.
I haven't gone through your whole back catalog though, so there's probably a few that I'm envious of.
Wait, do you have a list of questions that you're reading on?
I'm listening to us talking, and
you
are. It's actually. I'll be honest. It's difficult to get comfortable with you because you're a really good listener. So you stop talking and then you're listening, but it's my job to be the listener. It's easier when I'm interviewing somebody who likes to ramble.
You're just like giving compliments. You're pretty good at it.
Well, I do basically what you do. I just do it in the verbal realm.
Okay. Do you ever feel like a whore?
I feel, well, okay. That's really tricky. So one, I never called you that, so I don't think of you that way.
I'm a whore. Don't worry.
Okay.
I claim that word. No, it's not
anybody listening in here, I can feel the judgment of that. I have a very strong, I have to pay whenever I mess up. So I can't be fake, right? When I'm doing my stuff, I have to be authentic. So for me, so this is hard for me to map what I'm doing onto what you do, because I don't know what exactly I'm selling in the way that you are. But I have a friend who's very, very firm about the truth, and the truth is the only thing that matters. I'm like, you have to persuade people. He's like, persuasion's bullshit. You have to tell them the truth. He's very Aristotelian, right? I'm like, well, people don't listen to the truth. So in that way, there is aspects of seduction. There's aspects of subtle manipulation, or of catching the attention of others. Like I said earlier, like, you have to catch the attention, then you have to keep the attention, and then you have to change it. If you're really good at what you're doing in this realm of media, people come out the other side changed, right? So there's a whole series of manipulations that you are doing that I think do map on to the interaction of a male seeking out sexual stimulus, going through the process of achieving gratification of that, and then leaving out the other end with a different set of endorphins in his head. But honesty and authenticity are really important to me, so I don't give myself a lot of wiggle room.
Okay.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
Do you feel comfortable talking about yourself, or is this natural?
Do I feel uncomfortable talking about myself? Yeah. But okay. Wait, or is that natural? And it probably is natural, so... But there's a certain level of expectation that I'm violating by the conversation going back this way. So I have to readjust the whole thing. So if we were on your channel, then it would be completely different. I would just be letting loose, and you're asking me about, I don't know what you'd be interested in that I know of, but, whatever people are interested in, what I know of. So.
Cool. What did you ask about the tweets?
What about gender is changed? I'm sorry. Things have been changing really rapidly around gender in the last 5 years, but last 10 years, probably the last 20 years. It seems like there's this idea in the soup about gender being infinitely malleable. And you say very specifically, you link it, and other people that I've spoken to really link, like, gender and sex are part of the same thing. It seems like there's this idea in the mix of becoming gender atypical, intentionally being non-binary is one of the terms. What are some of your thoughts or insights into people who are starting to play around with that? And do you do that too?
Yeah, I think that we're not talking about the same thing. I think that when I think of gender, it's a completely different concept than what people who are non-binary think of gender as. And so, like, it's like sorry, my computer is fine. So the confusion like exists there because I think that like it's possible to share a frame that validates like both the way that I and likely you understand gender and also the way that like sexual progressives understand gender. Like there's obviously this tension between like gender is something that exists that you can sort of see on a person. Like it's quite obvious. Like to me, you look male, and if you said you weren't, like that would not change the way that I perceive you, even if I'm very on board with the thing that you say. Like there's some way that maleness is inherent to like a certain visual pattern, and that is like not something that people have any control over. And I think that when like the thing that I'm talking about when I say gender, or maybe also conservatives, although I don't identify as a conservative, mean when they talk about gender is this sort of immutable, ancient social pattern of this cluster of traits. Basically, you're exhibiting a cluster of traits, and that is highly correlated with sex, but not identical. Which I do think that like gender and sex are distinct, and people have a point when they say that, because like those are two sort of separate things that are not identical. Like if you had a vagina, I would still process you as male, although this just happens very rarely. So this is like what I think that gender. This is why that I understand it. But the people who view gender not as this thing, view it as internally determined, which is like such a different thing. Like how can you look at him like I'm looking at you? I'm going to use you as. How can you look like a male and be like that thing is internally determined? Like there's some sort of they're obviously not looking at the experience they have when they view a male and like are talking from that. Like there's this other thing going on that they're referring to. So we're not on the same page. We're not even talking about the same thing, which means that we're likely we don't actually disagree if you really got down to it. But the thing that I think maybe the issue is that I have a problem with, I don't have a problem with people trying to express themselves as non-binary or genderqueer or whatever. Like obviously there's a real thing going on and they're trying to communicate it. And I'm 100% down with that, and I want that to be accepted in society. The thing that I dislike is the sort of religious-esque use of concepts. So, for example, when I was Christian, I was taught a lot of religious concepts, like, for example, the hypostatic union or the communicato idiomatum, which are like ways to explain the way that Jesus and God are really the same, but also kind of not. Because in the Bible, there's a lot of really contradictory things about Jesus and God. Like, there's God, and then God like made Jesus, but like also not. And they're like, Jesus claims to be God sometimes, but also they seem like to have very distinct things. And God claims to be like infinite, and Jesus obviously was born and died. So we have to come up with a bunch of concepts to like make sense of that. And in reality, they're nonsensical. Like in reality, you're trying to force two things together that don't work, but you come up with things that make you feel like you know what's going on. You ask, oh, how did God and Jesus do this? And you're like, well, it's the hypostatic union. And you're like, oh shit, okay, there's the answer. Right? And so this is serving a purpose of like putting like the curious, it's like if your curiosity is like a muffler pipe, like or like a vacuum, it's like just stuffing a sock in it. And it stops it. You're like, okay, I am experiencing the sensation that I know what the answer is because I got a concept stuffer. And that concept stuffer, it does not deeply answer the question. It just surface answers the question. And I think that this is what non-binary and genderqueer stuff is. I think it's a curiosity stuffer. Like you're like, oh, hey, I'm having like really confusing feelings about like gender. Like I noticed that I really am having terrible feelings when people refer to me as a woman. And the answer that they give is, well, we have a concept stuffer for you. You are non-binary. And you're like, oh, cool. Like, I get it. I get this identity to take it. And it is serving a functional purpose. Like, it's giving people like a way to maneuver what they're experiencing. So I don't consider it bad in that regard. But I do not think it is like a deeply coherent concept. I think it is fundamentally incoherent. And this is like the issue that I have with it. And I want to find a better frame, mostly.
Do you have any ideas of where that new framework is or would be or might come from? Have you thought about that?
Not a whole bunch, but I would like to come up with something that isn't gender, but is similar to gender. Like, I don't know what word we could use, like bender or something. But like for example, when I see a non-binary person who is born a woman, I view them as woman in my head and non-binary. Like they're two separate categories.
Yeah. Okay.
Like a non-binary woman, like you're obviously have these female traits. You belong to the female cluster. You have no control over it. But there's a thing that you're trying to communicate to me about you that you do have control over, and which is something like maybe you are not stereotypically feminine in these ways, or when people view you stereotypically feminine, you are really uncomfortable. And that's like a secondary overlap. And so my ideal world is where we have just the two things, where people can have their gender, people can also have like their self-descriptors about the way they relate to gender, and have this just be like a double layered pie. That sounds great to me.
Why do you think it's so why do you think it's so popular right now? Why do you think it's captured so many people's imagination? And I might be, not to answer my own question, but it might be just overrepresented because it is so weird or different, let's say. But why do you think people get so involved in the gender identity matrix and all those things?
I think we're seeing less defined clusters, actually. So you know how like a woman has a vagina and long hair and raises children? And this is a very distinct cluster, and like maybe the man has some over here. I think like due to lack of scarcity, we're seeing a broadening of the actual clusters themselves. So I think this is a reflection of like reality and not necessarily a reflection of social perception, in the fact that like women are no longer bound to children in the way that they used to be. There's birth control and like welfare for helping raise kids and stuff like this. And also women are entering the workforce. So there's like legitimately meaningful ways that gender used to be represented that is no longer like a dichotomy. And so the actual clusters are starting to enlarge, and we're starting to see some sort of meaningful overlap. And the fact that you can play the fully masculine role now in a way that you weren't able to if you're a woman. And so I think that this is starting to like put a step, like this is the first step. And then also there's things like people really enjoy feeling like a unique identity or like a sense of bonding with other people who share that identity, like classic things that go into stuff like religion or like any other sort of phase. So just combine all those together.
If we get to a place where sex isn't linked to procreation, does it spiral out of control when it's decoupled from the act of procreation or the act of monogamy in a way? Without those barriers, does it lose meaning or no longer sustain meaning when it isn't sacralized? And I'm not asking on my behalf of myself, but just putting the thoughts out there because I know we share like a similar background where sex was defined very specifically, and in that definition had a lot of meaning. What happens when it's released from that?
Maybe it doesn't have meaning. I don't know. Maybe that's fine.
Like the kind of Camusian, or that doesn't sound like you're being nihilistic about it. How can something not have meaning? I
just assume that humans are really good at like figuring out meaning. Like,
okay,
if you remove sex from the things, like we're probably going to come up with more things or find meaning in a different place. Like I'm not like really fundamentally worried about sex being less meaningful. I'm sure there were a lot of things in history before that were much more meaningful than they are now, but we just have different things now. And like maybe sex is not going to be any less meaningful if you take it out of the confines of marriage, and maybe it's not even a problem we have to worry about, but it's not a problem anyway.
And the same with gender. And I'm kind of trying to fish around for thinking through a reactionary point of mind or somebody who is really resistant to people playing around with gender, just like another person has the same feelings about other people being a libertarian with their sexuality. Is there not a fear? Where does that fear come from? Of men not being men anymore, women not being women anymore, and the boundaries that aren't always bad, you know, like separate changing rooms or different sports categories. Once those categories don't have any basis, then it spirals out of control. And I guess that's what you were, part of the purpose of what you're talking about, having those two frames of reference, one sex, one gender, or one that's gender and this other thing.
Wait, so you're asking, are things going to get out of control if we don't have clear gender roles?
Yeah, and I'm not asking. I'm just posing that question, just to, you know,
because there are people watching have that question.
Yeah.
Maybe. Maybe. Well, I don't know, but that feels like kind of besides the point. Like when you have like really strong preferences for gender roles, I think that this is like for a reason. I think that this comes out of experiencing a world where gender roles actually benefit you. And I think that this is less and less a world that we're living in. I think to some extent it is. Like, I don't mean to deny the ways gender, like the fundamental parts of gender, like really impact our relationships. Like, not at all. Like, I'm a sex worker. It's extremely obvious to me that, that like the sexual dynamics are hugely important. But what was I saying? I don't remember.
You said it was besides the point.
Oh, yeah. Right. But gender roles are important, and certain standards of behavior are very important for certain environments. So this is why I'm not like mad at people who are very sexually conservative or like want very strict gender roles, because like it seems like appropriate response to a certain type of environment. And we've changed that environment and they still have that response. And I'm like, well, you're not like wrong. You're wrong in conjunction with the world we live in now. It's not like an absolute wrong. Like, I wouldn't say that the way that gender and sex are working now and the way I would like it to work are ideal for all potential combinations of reality. Like, there's definitely a civilization in which having only monogamous marriage seems ideal, but I don't think that this is it. And I think that like the mistake is in believing that there's one certain type of behavior that is ideal for all different forms of environment and all different forms of civilization. Like, and I don't think this is true. I think this is very different forms.
Do you have a conception of eros, like a philosophical conception of desire? And I know that's kind of old-timey. I mean, it's classical, I guess. Like, you have this god or Venus or something like that. And I'm asking in the question, I'm trying to make a interesting question out of a very boring question. Like, how do you not get bored of what you do? Or how do you know what you're dealing with in a creative manner? Like, is there a conception of desire that you're basing your creative variations of what you're doing on? How do you I don't know the life of a cam girl. So you're interacting with desire, right? Is there like, how do you keep that? How do you be smart about that? How do you be inventive with that? How do you not get bored of that?
Oh, well, I do get bored. I get very bored sometimes. It's astonishing how men just like the same thing.
Okay, it's pretty easy. Incredible. Well, there we go.
I was so impressed. Like, I couldn't do that. Like, I need like brand new shit every time. Like I told her the same porn twice. But like, I'm just so impressed. So anyway, I very often like will do things like post a thing like, I can't, like, there's no way people actually want to see like the boobs again, and yet they do. So that's shocking to me, and that is like. But it's maybe a little more safe than boring. Like, if ever I'm feeling creative really run out, I can just be like, well, I can just go back to the bread and butter and people will like it. But I find that it's actually really good for creativity, this realm, because a lot of the standards are very low. What men expect out of a naked woman is like the bar is just so low to the ground. You could
that she doesn't have any clothes on, or a minimal amount.
Yeah. Right. So as soon as I take my clothes off, like the bar for me being interesting drops. I know what I'm doing. People are like, wow, it's a girl, she gets naked and she has thoughts. They don't even have to be that great thoughts. So basically, like, the creativity is like actually much more encouraging environment. Like, if I'm trying to be creative, like say on YouTube with an established array of people, I might be able to do it. It would be harder. But in sex work field, like I mentioned, I'm a mime, and I just got famous for being a mime. Or I did a set of photos where I got abducted by gnomes and like dragged away.
Oh, you're the gnome girl. You were really famous on Reddit. That was like a decade ago or something like that. You're the gnome girl. Oh my God, I'm talking to the gnome girl. Sorry. I guess I showed my cards of internet knowing, but...
No, you did. That was very flattering to me. Like, it's great when that happens. Right, and so like it was just a stupid set, right? But like, because it was in the context of nudity, it was very surprising.
Yeah.
The bar is pretty low. I'm pretty like generally happy with it.
Are you gonna do you do podcasts? Are you thinking about starting something verbal, audio verbal kind of stuff?
Yeah, actually. I really want to do a podcast series because I'm very experienced at asking questions. I've asked and
you're very good at it.
Over like maybe 1,500 questions, and I run a company where I sell a deck of questions that I've researched to be the most like divisive and interesting. This is
askhole.com. Yeah.
So I'm very into questions, and so I want to run a podcast where the focus of my interviewing style is to ask meta questions about like the experience of being in the conversation, and also ones that might be like particularly uncomfortable to answer.
Yeah, you put me on the spot, so you have that talent.
Thank you.
When is that starting up? Is there anything that we can plug? We'll plug your OnlyFans. I don't know if YouTube will let me do that, but we can at least say it out loud.
It's I have like a link tree. I have a whole bunch of shit.
Yeah, link tree. Okay, yeah. But when is your these other projects starting up?
I'm working on a couple other relatively big things right now. So I'm like, cool. The podcast is like second degree. As soon as I have a slot open up, then I think I'm gonna try that.
Wait, what did you say about being a slut? What was it called?
Slot.
Slot.
Slot. I have a couple slots.
Oh, I was okay.
My project.
It did sound to my benefit, to my ears, that you said slut.
Well, yeah, given the context.
There we go.
Yeah.
Well, cool. Thanks for letting me have you on. You're the first bathing beauty that I've had on my show, so you're breaking some sort of ceiling. I don't know what the fibers are. Do you have any projections on our political, where we are politically and where we're going to be headed?
Do I have any projections on where we are currently?
Yeah. Well, I mean, like where we're going to be concurrently, because we're in a suspended state. I don't know. We've been off Twitter for an hour, so maybe things have resolved themselves. But...
Oh, yeah. I just assumed that I'm just following the prediction markets, basically.
Okay. And
they seem to be very pro-Biden, so I'm probably not better at guessing reality than the prediction markets are.
Do you think that the tenor of our time will change under a Biden administration?
I hope so. I'm hoping it'll become less polarized, although I don't know. I feel very not equipped or educated enough to be able to have a good response to that.
Are you concerned about that, or do you do any work just compassion-wise on trying to get people less polarized? Do you have any tricks up your sleeve on doing that?
I ironically do it so aggressively. Like on Twitter, I'm like, be less polarized, you piece of shit. Have some compassion. And I watch myself typing these tweets, like just angrily telling people to be compassionate. What am I? Yeah, I would like people to become less polarized. Like, obviously, Trump voters are people who have legitimate feelings, and I'm mostly angry at the liberals right now because like that's what I get. And when I get the right wingers being mad at me, then I hate them too. But like lately, it's been mostly liberals who hate me, so I'm mad at them. Yeah, I feel like the polarization seems like something that's not going to be solved by just the presidency. I mean, the presidency feels like a symptom or like a result out of a much deeper thing, and I don't feel like I deeply understand the deeper thing well enough to make really good predictions about it.
Okay.
Like it seems like maybe something internet causing it, but that feels like a little bit hand wavy. So I'm not sure. Yeah,
it's a deep problem. As long as you're doing what you can to fix it, no judgment from my point of view. I'm kidding.
What if I'm not doing what I can to fix it?
Yeah, I'm saying you can do whatever you want. I'm not going to tell you what to do. Congratulations for reaching the end of the podcast. If you enjoyed this product, consider donating to this channel via paypal.me/Benjamin Boyce or joining me on Patreon. Also follow me on Twitter at Benjamin A. Boyce. Have a good night.